Hello everyone, welcome to the landscape painting part 1 video. Today we're going to be creating a landscape. We're going to be focusing on masking techniques, creating some texture techniques, and again just blending colors and creating gradients. So I have some painter's tape there. Masking tape would work well as well. I have a little bit of a sponge, old plastic knife, a couple brushes, pencil to sketch it out with. And the colors that I'm working with today, I have a couple whites, brown, black, blue, yellow, and 2 greens. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a border, and I'm going to do that with the masking tape there. And I do that so that after I'm done the painting, I can remove that border of masking tape and I will have a nice clean edge around the outside of it. Nice frame. So I'm putting about a 1/4 inch border here. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start a sketch, and I'm going to toss in the horizon here. It's about halfway down my piece of paper. And I'm just creating some forest or vegetation off in the distance. I'm going to end up creating this image that is going to have vegetation in the distance. There's going to be kind of like a lake, almost like you're in a bay, and there'll be one prominent tree or focal point. So I'm just roughing in there, kind of the background, trees, foliage. Now I'm just creating the shoreline there with my pencil. I'm thinking about the reflections that you would see in the water and just trying to plan those out. Now I'm going to slightly modify this bottom shoreline here, just erase a little bit, because I want the tree to be on land and not off the frame. So I'm just drawing in the trunk there. All this is very, very basic. This is just a rough framework that I'm going to follow once I start putting paint down. As soon as I start putting paint down, a lot of this is going to be covered. So it's just an initial plan for what I'm going to paint. I'm just kind of roughing in the leaves and how big the canopy of that tree is going to be closest to us. Just thinking about where the light source is going to be and where the cast shadow of the tree is going to be. So it's going to be cast down on this kind of grassy bank right about there. I'm going to try to make it quite dark just to add some contrast to it. So again, thinking about the light and how it would cast that shadow. I also want to think about how that light would hit other objects in this scene. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some masking tape along that horizon line. In this part 1 video, I'm just going to focus on what is happening above that horizon line. The reason I'm using tape is that I can set up a nice clean edge, and I don't have to worry about painting too far down or getting a little bit sloppy, kind of like the edge of the apple that happened there in the previous video. So there we go. You can see that's the foliage in the back. There's the sky up above. And again, I'm just masking what is below that line. I'll end up removing that at the end just to create that nice clean horizon. So I'm going to start with some blue mixed with a little bit of white, and I'm going to water it down, and I'm going to focus on just creating the sky. So this is going to be painted over everything. The foliage on the sides there, the tree canopy. This is essentially the furthest object or part of the scene back from the viewer. And then I'm going to progressively paint closer and closer to the viewer as we run into other objects. So I'm just going with blue with a little bit of water there. I'm going to create a gradient where it's dark blue at the top and then it kind of fades to a lighter blue as it comes down towards the horizon. So now I'm going to mix a little bit of white in with the blue. Just place that underneath. I'm going to brush it into the blue above to kind of start that blending process. Trying to create that gradient, that smooth transition from the darker blue down to the lighter blue. As you can see, I'm painting over everything, even the pencil lines that I had to set up the scene, because this has to be essentially the underpainting. Everything else will be painted over top of this. I'm just kind of getting the paint down really quick, not worrying too much about the gradation at this point. I just want that paint to remain wet while I'm painting here, so that when I go to blend, it'll be easier to accomplish it. Again, taking a little bit of paint off the brush when I'm brushing over the edges where that darker blue meets the kind of mid-tone blue. Now I'm getting some water on the brush and using that wet brush blending technique again. Just trying to get a smooth transition between tones. Just adding a little bit of a lighter value right at the bottom. Okay, so I'm just cleaning off my brush because I'm about to start using some of the white tones to start to create some clouds, and I just don't want any of the blue that I had for the sky mixing with the whites for right now. So I'm actually going to add a little bit of black here. The way I'm going to develop these clouds is I'm going to paint kind of a darker value first, and that's going to be the bottom of the clouds. Then I'll take a lighter value, a whiter value, and build up above that. It just helps to create a little bit of depth to the clouds. Now I'm using a texture technique there. Instead of painting with the side of the bristles, I'm using the edges of the bristles, and I'm just kind of dabbing down. And that's going to create a different texture than what is in the sky. And it's a subtle thing, but again, it creates contrast between the brush strokes and the way that I'm applying color. So you can see it's kind of like a mid-tone gray at this point, and I'm just dabbing it on. So adding a little bit more white to that, just lightening it up. Again, I'm using 3 tones. We talked about this in rendering. We always have a midtone, a shadow, and a highlight at the very least to make something look three-dimensional. So I'm doing the same thing just with color tones. So I put in my shadow tone. Now I'm putting in the mid-tone. And again, using that kind of dabbing textural technique. And again, I'm using one of those flat brushes that has an edge. And all the white values they are overlapping the gray, but they're above the gray. So there's this kind of bottom gray area or darker area on each of the clouds. Okay, so I've grabbed the sponge there. It's just an old dish sponge, and I'm just kind of dabbing over top of those values. And this is kind of a way to blend and again create a different texture. It tends to smooth things out. Adding a little bit more contrast at this point, going with almost a pure white now. Again, this would be my third tone. I did the shadow tones, the mid-tones. This is now the highlights, so this is where the sun is hitting those clouds. Now I did plan for where the foliage is going to be on that tree that's in the front, and I made sure not to paint any clouds that would be covered by that, because again, that's just kind of wasting time and effort. I'm going to go back in with my pencil there, and I just want to create kind of a plan for where I'm going to create that background foliage again. So for this technique right here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to end up painting the darkest values first that would be in that foliage in that tree canopy in the background. And then I'm going to progressively work lighter colors into it, covering less and less of the foliage as I go. And that's going to create a little bit of depth, and combined with using a sponge and kind of the dabbing technique is also going to create a texture. Somewhat similar to the clouds, but again, there'll be a subtle difference that'll kind of set them apart. So I'm going with a really, really dark green at this point. I added some blue and I added the tiniest little bit of black. But again, this is the darkest value that you would see. Even if you only see it a little tiny bit, if there's just little hints of it, as in shadow values in the leaves in the back there, that's the value that you want to put down first. A lot of it, the vast majority of it, will be covered with lighter values later. I'm making sure to get up over top of that tape when I paint, because again, that paint's there to create that nice crisp horizon. So there's the sponge there, and I'm just going to kind of dab it to start. And it's just creating this texture on the surface of the paint, and it kind of blends the different hues in that green, kind of smooths them out. So I added a little bit of green, just a slightly lighter value, and I'm just dabbing it with the sponge, trying to hit just the top of that canopy in the background. So I've gone with a slightly lighter value. The sponge I was using there ended up being a little bit too thick. I would have preferred to maybe cut it down almost into a triangle shape so I had a finer point I could work with. You can see right there I tried to make it a little bit smaller, but just the thickness was a little too much. So now I'm going to add a little bit more detail. I'm going straight paint here, and there's no water at all. And I'm just kind of dabbing these kind of little leaf shapes, circular type shapes, mostly on the top of that darker mass. And I'm going to start with a green, then I'm going to mix a little bit of yellow in there, and then go almost straight yellow. And this is all to create the illusion of form, make it look three-dimensional, make it look like the tops of the canopy is being picked up by the light source, by the sun. I purposely try to leave a little bit more darker values at the tips of those two canopies, because in my mind they were the furthest back. And just like in sketching, in pencil shading, the darker something is, typically the further back it's going to get pushed into the drawing. So it's just, again, another small way to create a little bit more depth. So this is a really tiny brush here. You might not have access to something this small. You could use something as simple as a Q-tip. That's quite effective for creating texture and having a small tool to work with. So you can see I've mixed in some yellow with the green, and I'm going to start applying it over top of that green I first put down. Less is going to be covered, so as I progressively lighten up these values, less and less is applied, and mostly just to the tops of the canopies there, because that's where the sun would hit. See, now we're going straight yellow, and just little bits here and there. This would just be kind of the leaves sticking out the furthest from the rest of the canopy. And I'm putting less and less as I go back further away there. So now I'm going to repeat that process over on the other side there. Every once in a while, I'm creating a stroke that goes into the blue just to make it look like the tops of trees sticking out. So at this point, I'm trying to create a little bit stronger tree shapes and creating like kind of central emphasis ones that'll stick out, just to let the viewer know what type of foliage that is back there. So I've added a little bit of water and white here, and I'm starting to work it into those clouds. I purposely let them dry for a little bit, and now I'm going to go over with kind of like a white wash, and that's going to help blend some of those tones a little bit better, create a little bit more of the cloud sort of texture, kind of transparency. Because these have dried for a little bit, you can only affect it so much. It's not like when we were doing the sky, for example, where the colors could really blend with a wet brush. Now, it just kind of smooths things out. It's a little bit different. I'm just putting some highlights on the tops of those clouds. gone in with a wet brush there, and I'm again just hitting the blue of the sky, just creating a smoother gradient, smoother transition. Again, just like the clouds, because it has been allowed to dry for a little bit, it's not going to change as much with the blending. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to remove that masking tape. Just be very gentle with it. If your paint's still too wet, just let it dry. Take it off, and now you have a nice, clean, straight horizon line there. So that's pretty much it for the end of this video. In the next video, we will focus on creating what's below that horizon line. At this point, I'm just kind of sketching in the tree there, just imagining where it's going to fit, where it's going to be over top of the background there. One of the reasons I've split this into a two-part video is in order to do below the horizon line, we're going to have to mask above it. And we have to have the paint dry for that point. If it's not dry when you put the tape down, it's just going to rip off the surface. So now we need to wait for it to dry. So thank you so much for watching this video. Like I said, stay tuned for part 2.